So a word again of welcome to all of you who made the journey to campus, hopefully safe and sound. It was late last fall that Lita approached some of us about a couple of conversations she was having as a result of the wider public conversations about the Ferguson protest, and just asked if there were some way that we might as a community think out loud about the relatively surprising but pervasive conversation that has arisen as a result of the events in Ferguson as well as Staten Island. And so that's what we're here to talk about. We're just thrilled that you're here. I'm going to introduce the panel in a moment, but I just want to say a couple of words by way of introduction that have come onto my plate recently. The deans and presidents of the historically African-American schools in the ATS, the American Theological Society, including our very own Dean Harden, Mark, put together a statement, and I'd like to just read part of it that serves as a nice prelude to our conversation here. They gathered at their annual meeting and put a statement out, and I just want to read part of it. From a manger in Bethlehem, a Bantustan in Soweto, a bus in Montgomery, a Freedom Summer in Mississippi, a bridge in Selma, a street in Ferguson, a doorway and shots fired in Detroit, a Moral Monday in Raleigh, an assault in an elevator in Atlantic City, an office building in Colorado Springs, a market in Paris, a wall in Palestine, the kidnapping and assault of young school-age girls, and the reported killing of 2,000 women, children, and men in Nigeria, God sends a sign, a kairos moment, a reminder that the racial climate and the respect for our common humanity everywhere is in decline. How can we continue with business as usual in our theological schools in the midst of so many egregious injustices? The statement goes on, we believe that the citizens of good conscience must arise and call our nation to assess and address the rising tide of injustice throughout our legal and criminal justice systems. There must be restraint to those who shoot, kill, and maim in the streets of our nation. And so, we call on our churches to challenge their members and communities to live out an inclusive commitment to love God, to love the self, to love the neighbor, and especially to love the enemy across any and all boundaries that would dehumanize, alienate, and separate. We call on all Americans of good conscience who gather across the country to speak out for liberty and justice for all, always. As our modern-day prophet Martin Luther King Jr. noted, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. In part, not simply as a response to that open letter, we do want to enter the conversation, to think out loud about the nature of justice and injustice in a world like ours, and to speak about it in light of the vocations many of you are here to prepare for, to speak into the public square with the values and the virtues of reconciliation that emerge out of the gospel. And so let me just say a very brief word about who's going to be on our panel this morning. And I just invite all three of you to come on up for a time now. Our very own dean of our Boston campus, Dr. Mark Harden, is going to lead off our comments. Professor of Community Development and Outreach, as well as the dean of the Boston campus, longtime dean at Bethel Seminary before coming here to Gordon-Conwell of Intercultural Relations, ordained, a Baptist pastor as well, and uniquely to speak into this set of issues, also 10 years on the police force in Detroit, Michigan, prior to entering into ministry. Beside Mark, our president, Dr. Dennis Hollinger, professor of Christian ethics, and so speaks into the questions of our civil order and disorder. Dennis is a board member also of the National Association of Evangelicals, a group that has quite insistently wrestled with questions of justice and injustice as well. And we know by now that it is imperative that we think about how the gospel affects the head and the heart and the hands. So Dr. Hollinger has written. Finally, but surely not least, we welcome anew to our panel, Dr. Emmett Price. Now, I can call him one of our own since he is an adjunct professor here at Gordon-Conwell, teaching a course for us this semester on the theology and practice of worship. When he's not here with us, he is actually professor of ethnomusicology at Northeastern University, having also chaired the African American Studies Department at Northeastern, a scholar of hip-hop, of jazz, of the spirituals, of world music. I think there are few things Emmett is not a scholar of, actually. A longtime pastor, and he is also an alum of Gordon-Conwell. And so it is a great honor and privilege to have all three of our individuals. And I'm going to just turn the mic over to Dr. Harden first, and then without introduction over to Dr. Hollinger, and then Dr. Price. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Lentz, and especially thank you, Dr. Lentz, for making this happen, your office. This is timely, and it's a very important issue that I've dealt with my entire life, especially my professional life. I basically broke up what I wanted to say into three parts. I want to talk about sort of the African-American context, police training and the reality of being a police officer, and then talk about things from basically my experience as a researcher and teacher in the area of intercultural relations, and what I've learned that I think is fitting for helping us to deal with the challenge of racial reconciliation in particular, but not only racial reconciliation, but any reconciliation around any of the isms, sexism and ageism and so forth that we have to deal with as individuals in our lives. But when I want to put this in context, when I say in African American context, I really mean my personal observation and as a part of my story, but not just my story, but your story. As I look around the room, and this is frightening, 99% of you seem younger than I am, so this is indeed an historical moment. But I also want to apologize for, I came here by way of Minnesota, and I did not intend to bring Minnesota with me. But it seems as though we're back in Minnesota just these last few weeks. But what do I mean by our story? We have gotten to this black and white language, and a few of us in the room know that it hasn't always been just black and white language. It was many languages. Our country has a story, an overarching story that draws us all into its history. And there was a time when Italians were lynched in every single state in this country, along with African slaves and African Americans after slavery, and the Jews and the Irish and so forth. And so this sort of ethnocentric behavior has really given us a dark side of our history in this country. And it doesn't just happen between neighbor and neighbor, it happens between systems. It's corrupted many of our systems, our health systems, our economic systems, our political systems, our court and justice systems, and so forth. And even in families. When I was a kid, they would say that you were just a black person, even if you had white parents or you were biracial. You didn't have a choice in the matter. Today, people have a choice to say what they have. But the courts, for over 100 years, have made decisions based on white power. Not just going back in the Reconstruction era, but even in recent, the early part of the 20th century, where white power had to be remained. And I understand, by teaching for 10 years on racial relations in ministry and seminary, that a lot of my quote-unquote white brothers and sisters often would resist the whole notion of privilege. But privilege was a legal matter. For many ways, and it was argued and adjudicated, and there was Jim Crow that was instituted that we weren't able to conquer and get rid of Jim Crow in a legal sense until the 60s. But if you think about that context, and I'm almost done with this story because this context is important. Before World War II, ethnicity was a huge deal. But going around the world, our GIs were exposed to cultures around the world, and they came back. And so in the 50s, we tried to make everything better by saying that we're all one. And this is where the phrase melting pot comes in, that America is diverse and is a melting pot. But there was still the status quo, so everybody wasn't included in that melting pot. So then you weren't no longer Irish or Polish American or Italian American. You were just white. So this notion of white is what we've, in recent decades, have come to sear in our brain and our mind. And then in reaction to whiteness in the civil rights movement, there was blackness that was produced, black power. And that's when I grew up. I grew up in a context where we weren't no longer going to be labeled Negroes. We were going to call ourselves black, in opposition to white power, where we were being left out. And that was a reality. And so the civil rights victories happened, and out of that, we eventually caught African Americans. And I still talk with people today that don't really understand the term African American. So a part of our story is understanding. One philosopher, Bill Jones, said that we jumped from segregation into integration without understanding differences, and that was our problem. And I would go further than that. It's not just understanding the differences within humanity, but it's also understanding the oneness of humanity that's critical. And a lot of us Christians who preach that and prophesy and so forth and try to live that, we fail miserably because we are capable and wired in such a way, in an ethnocentric way, that we respond to differences. And even though we believe in Jesus in our heart, we still have prejudices that we harbor against people simply because of differences. And so African American, to me, is an ethnic term, and technically is an ethnic term, and it's a specific culture. Yes, I'm black, but that's a racial term, and that's because of the history of our country as opposed to African American. I'm black in a racial sense, but I'm African American. Different from Jamaican American, different from Caribbean American, and even Cuban American, where I have Afro brothers, and Puerto Rican Americans, where I have Afro brothers. We all share blackness, but we don't share ethnicity and culture necessarily. But once you build up in your mind or make up your mind, even unconsciously, that people of a certain racial category have certain behaviors and differences about them that you reify, as we say as social scientists, and we set them apart from us as though we're not connected to them and as though they're so different. We make them inferior by comparison to ourselves whom we know, and them who we don't know. They become other. And that is the story that we're living with and trying to work out. Now, as a police officer, I was trained 6 months, police officers go through training, 4.5 to 6 months, depending on what department and the level of government you are in. But 6 months of training, and a lot of that training, and for the street police officer, you walk away with 3 things you don't forget that they drill in you. One is that when you use your firearm, you're using deadly force. Even when you pull it out, you have the potential to use deadly force. There is no wound the person or in between. It's very black and white. So they drill that when you pull it out and you make up in your mind to use that firearm, you shoot to kill, you don't shoot to wound. That's the training that you walk away with. And not only that, and I'm moving a little quicker, but the police officer, most police officers know 3 laws. 3 court decisions. They know many, but 3 are on your mind. One is Tennessee versus Gardner, where in 1985, the Supreme Court ruled that you cannot shoot a fleeing felon at all, never. Unless the person has a hand grenade and he's about to throw it into a crowd. Then you got a little decision where you can justify it. But if the person is unarmed, you cannot shoot a fleeing felon, even if you know that they just robbed a bank with a butter knife. You can't shoot them. Every officer knows that. Second thing is Miranda, that you read them their rights, that they have a right to due process, that they cannot be convicted and executed in the street. Every officer knows that. Thirdly, Terry versus Ohio. I still remember these things being removed from law enforcement. And Terry is the pat down fist. You pat somebody down. And the court said that the only right you have to pat somebody down to see what's under their garment is when you suspect that your life is in danger. You just can't, just because you're a police officer, search someone and violate their constitutional rights. Those are 3 things every officer knows. So I have mixed feelings when I watch all of what's happening on the news in regards to all of these cases. And I do view these cases as very different. And I do reflect on when the many times I've been shot at and the many times I've had to make a decision whether to shoot. I reflect on that. I know what it's like to let your guard down and discover that an assailant that you just apprehended had a gun. And that body language you noticed was him or her looking for an opportunity to take you out. I know what that's like firsthand. I know what it's like to be in that gray moment. Now, when I graduated from police academy, they said, you can't shoot anybody. When you draw your gun, that's when you intend to kill. You've made up mentally in your mind to do that. When I became a police officer and I came across my senior training officer in the field and we would walk into a dangerous situation, he says, where's your gun? I said, this is my holster. I don't pull it out unless I plan to kill somebody. He says, oh no, you pull it out and you get it ready because somebody might be behind the door ready to take you out. So there's the training you have, but then there's the reality of the streets in which you have to make a call when you pull out the gun. So I do empathize and understand, but I have to confess to you that I have not agreed with every decision that has been handed down in that regard. But I understand that the first rule of every day as an officer is to go home alive. And when there's a potential threat, your training tells you eliminate the threat. Eliminate it. Now, the problem comes in recognizing humanity, and I know that I'm pushing time, so let me move to this last point in a few seconds over it. 85% of the people in this world are not aware of their social identity, their cultural, who they are culturally. I mean, people tell us we're male, people tell us we're female, people tell us we're black or white or whatever. But we already know that statistically as social scientists. We know that 15% of that 85%, there are people who avoid differences altogether. They don't talk about it. They just in this avoidance mode. They just don't even think about those people. Just don't even. In fact, there's too much anxiety for them to deal with it. So they like going along in life happily, just pretending that there's other people, but there's just me and my group. Then there's that second level group that has experienced differences and they've reacted to it in such a way that they develop a fear, I would say, a prejudice. Now, God has wired us to all be prejudiced. There's nobody in this room that doesn't have a prejudice. I'm sorry. God has wired us to stereotype. That's a part of human survival. We need to stereotype because we've got to figure out who this person or those people are. We fill in the blanks when we don't have right information. Sorry, we all do that naturally because we're wired that way. The problem comes when we're not open to realizing that instead of stereotyping serving us as servants, they become our masters. And my fear is that some police officers do indeed allow their stereotypic information to become the master at that moment in their judgment. And that's my opinion. It's based on research in terms of this category. But people who cannot humanize other because they have allowed the stereotype to dehumanize that other for them are more dangerous than any other group. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for very, very insightful comments. And thank you all for coming for this very important discussion today. I think that what happened in Ferguson, in both the killing of Michael Brown and in the events following that, clearly give evidence that we have a lot of unfinished business in American society. All of us know that we have a very sad history when it comes to racial issues, from the brutal institution of slavery, the Jim Crow laws following emancipation, which, as Mark said, continued up into the 1960s, and that's was at the heart of what the civil rights movement was about. And of course, the kinds of racism and prejudice that continue into the 21st century, perhaps in less overt form, but still very much there. And if you've seen the movie Selma, and if you haven't seen it, let me really encourage you to see it. It is a very insightful movie. It's a lens into what happened in the 1960s civil rights movement. And people can quibble, as they do always about movies, about historical parts and so forth. But it's a very powerful movie, and I commend it to you. But in that movie, you see precisely what was going on in the 1960s. An opening scene where a woman goes to register to vote, is asked all kinds of questions that none of us sitting in the room could have answered. I couldn't have answered with a PhD, and denied the right to vote because she got almost all the answers right, except for one bizarre question. It was a really unbelievable scene. I spent the first 10 years of my life living in southern Alabama, very rural, remote, racist area, and I remember well as a child the white-only signs in restrooms, the white-only signs in drinking fountains. I remember the reaction of my classmates when the Supreme Court handed down the decision of desegregation in the 1950s. Too often, it seems to me that society at large, and the Christian church in particular, have turned a blind eye to what was happening and is happening today. My sister and brother-in-law live near Chicago, and they went to see the movie Selma the other night. And they live in an area that's a very highly educated area. And after the movie, they heard a woman who was sitting behind them say to her husband, "Did that really happen?" They went out into the corridor of the theater, and they heard a couple ask an older man who had clearly lived through the 1960s, "Did you ever hear about that in the news? Did you ever hear in the news about what was going on then?" And the response was, "I don't remember hearing much about it." Now, I can tell you, as one having lived through the 1960s, you had to be in hibernation, have your head in the sand, not to know what was going on in the 1960s with regards to the civil rights movement. But the point is that many chose then and many chose now to deny reality. As we think about Ferguson, the precipitating event and the responses to it, our own personal experiences and our perceptions on racial issues in general have a huge impact in how we respond. Even our interpretations of what may have happened or may not have happened with regards to Michael Brown and the white police officer Darren Wilson is impacted by our experiences, is impacted by our perceptions. Those of you who've taken an ethics class with me know that one of the things I talk about is that our differences on ethical issues and social issues isn't just about the differing principles that we might use or differing moral paradigms or differing interpretations of biblical texts. Often, our differences are about differing interpretations of the facts. What was going on in the situation? Our empirical judgments about the realities around us have a profound impact. And our perceptions, our experiences in life feed into that powerfully. This was brought home to me a very clear way this fall. I was at a gathering of evangelical leaders, and the president of the NAE, the National Association of Evangelicals, told of an incident of a conference that he had attended a couple of years ago that was focused on racial justice and racial reconciliation. One of the African American gentlemen who spoke asked a question. He said, first of all, I want to ask a question to my white brothers here. He said, how many of you as whites have taught your son that when you are pulled over by a policeman, you keep your hand on the steering wheel and you look straight ahead? No hands went up. He then said to my black brothers, how many of you have taught your sons that if you're pulled over by a police officer, you keep your hands on the steering wheel and you look straight ahead? And 90% of the African American hands went up. As a white male, I've never been pulled over because of the color of my skin. I don't know what that's like. And I think police officers probably had some traffic violations they could have pulled against me for speeding a bit, but I haven't had to endure what my brothers on each side of me have had to endure just in that arena of life. Obviously, our social context powerfully shape our perceptions of what is happening, and those perceptions impact how we respond to events like Ferguson. As I think about Ferguson and the protest responses, it drives me to ask the question, what is a healthy society? What is a healthy community? And one way of thinking about this, I believe, is to say that a healthy society is one that can hold three things together. And you hold them together in a kind of healthy tension. Those three are justice, freedom, and order. If you have a society in which one of those dominates and the others are neglected, you're bound to have trouble. And actually, I think the case can be made that historically, these three, justice, freedom, order, represent differing theories that have existed about political life, about the nature and purposes of the state. A society that emphasizes all justice and freedom, but no order, would end up with what? Anarchy. And when you have anarchy, it's pretty hard to achieve justice, and you often end up in a very oppressive state, when the whole purpose was to somehow achieve freedom. And many have said that historically that's precisely what happened in the 18th century with the French Revolution. But a society that emphasizes order and neglects freedom and justice tends towards oppression. Rights are neglected and freedom is minimized. It seems to me then that we need a society in terms of both the political order and the culture at large that are truly committed to justice, which means procuring basic rights for all and making sure that there are mechanisms in place. This gets at the systemic part that Mark talked about, mechanisms in place to ensure that justice. Second, we need freedom for all people to live and work as they desire, to carry on life as they desire, And as I often like to point out, our plea for freedom will mean that some people in their freedom will choose ways of life, lifestyles that will be contrary to our Christian commitments. But we ensure that freedom as long as that freedom does not stamp upon the freedom and justice of others. And third, order, in which lawlessness is held in check, in which people are held accountable by both law and, as a last resort, by force in order to maintain order in that society. Now, my sense is that what happened in Ferguson, in both the precipitating event and the aftermath, was that order dominated, particularly in terms of the local government as well as the state of Missouri, that order dominated to the neglect of freedom and justice. And when that happens, it's bound to result in protest. And unfortunately, often in that kind of a situation, there is counter-violence to the initiating or precipitating violence. As Dr. Martin Luther King so powerfully evidenced in his life and teaching, and is certainly lucidly portrayed in the movie Selma, there is a place for peaceful protests and sometimes even thoughtful civil disobedience to bring about change in a society. The intentions and the parameters of the protests must be, of course, abundantly clear, as it always was for Dr. King and the civil rights movement in the 1960s. What Dr. King knew so well, and I think was forgotten in Ferguson, is that justice and freedom and order must go hand in hand. All three must exist in a healthy tension with each other. And by the way, this isn't the place to do it, but one can make a case biblically and theologically for each of those three. But I believe that if we are to make strides in American society, and let me say in other societies around the world, because we're not the only country that has a race-ethnic problem. It's everywhere. It's ubiquitous throughout all of the world. Travel into any society and you will find it. And if we're to make strides on these issues, it seems to me that we need to be committed to that very, yes, healthy tension. And we don't like tensions, but conceptually, sometimes they are the best way in which we can live, holding together justice, freedom, and order. Thank you.
As always, it's a privilege to be here, and I thank all of you for your attention and your prayers through this dialogue. I think this is a very intimate conversation, one that we all come to with our own perspectives, proclivities, and perceptions as well. And I think that's healthy to have this conversation here. I always wonder, why is it not that these conversations take the lead in these venues amongst those who are seeking God's face? Why is it not that the conversation doesn't start here? And so my approach to this is, as a young person who was born and raised in Los Angeles, California, in the city. Some people call it South Central, but there really is no South Central Los Angeles television. And so for me, growing up in the heat of the Bloods and the Crips, and I would argue one of the most corrupt police departments in the country under the leadership of Daryl Gates, that our realities are not always shared. And I want to start there because it's hard to have a common approach to seeing the situations and scenarios when our lenses are not the same. Dr. Hollinger talked about the differing approach to the gentleman who talked about the hands on the steering wheel when the cops pulled them over. I learned that at 6, and I remember it vividly because 6 was around the time when my parents allowed me to walk from my home to my grandmother's home, which was not that far away. And I had to learn the rules of engagement before I was allowed out of the house independently. And so if you talk about a young person with an anxiety of the realities of life, versus someone who doesn't have that anxiety, you're talking about two very different worlds. And so for some, freedom sounds and looks different. Justice sounds and looks different. And order sounds and looks different. Because from my perspective, order was either not getting caught, right, or being able to have safe passage from one place to another place, right? It was never the sense that the civil servants were there to protect and serve you. They were there to protect and serve everybody else but you, right? And so whether that's right or wrong, I can't get into that, but the reality of certain individuals. So when we come to the table to have this conversation, that's why in certain areas, when people say that justice delayed is justice denied, right? It becomes difficult to have the divine patience to wait for that moment when we all are equal and all can benefit from justice. So my colleagues here have talked about the notion of power and about white privilege and what I would call systems of oppression. I would talk about the fact that reconciliation really doesn't come until we focus on the common denominators as well as the least of these, right? Reconciliation does not come until you focus on the common denominators, right? Because we often come to the table, and we talk about racial reconciliation, and whoever is representing the various races or ethnicities or nationalities at the table always come with a personal agenda, right? There are certain things that we want, but the question is always, what are you willing to give up? And that's when the table goes silent, right? When we talk about the freedoms that come with privilege, or the freedoms that come with a sense of privileged justice, or the freedoms that come from a sense of privileged order, and the fact of having to give those up in order for others to enjoy the privilege of that, that's a conversation we don't want to have. And so that's why we often talk about the conversation of racial relations, right, in terms of relationships with one another, as opposed to racial reconciliation. We're just not ready to have the racial reconciliation conversation because, and that means a shift of power, right? And we've been kind of taught, depending on what your mental approach is, that power does not yet necessarily yielded, it's taken, right? And so you have this tension here in terms of what do you do when you want to do the right thing, but you're not necessarily willing to give up, right? I mean, that's why I love the whole section in Acts 2-5 when you talk about the early church. I mean, you see the early church really, really forming fellowship and community, particularly Acts, 2, around 42 to 47, where they talk about they were selling all of their possessions, right? And we often fantasize about that by saying it takes a village, but usually that's an outward thing. And I remember living in Los Angeles, and we had some churches that were doing some phenomenal mission work. And they were raising money for fresh water over here and raising money for clothes over here. And I would always say, man, right outside your church, outside of the gate that you put up, right? Right? You have people who need fresh water and who need clothes. And so our imagery and our fantasization of outward, right? And we're doing good work. We're doing missionary work, right? And I'm not suggesting that that's not good. I believe that God has called some of us to do some of that, called some of us to be missionaries in our own backyard, right? Around our corners, right? And so the fact is that the semantics, the how we understand it is really important. So there's this anxiety, but disruption is necessary, I would argue. It's necessary because if we didn't have disruption, then this wonderful aggregation of wonderful saints in this room wouldn't be here, right? We wouldn't have certain institutions where women could actually be educated. We wouldn't have opportunities for people of color and all these different things if there was not disruption. Selma, the movie, was about a moment in time which was disruptive, right? And so whether we perceive it as disorder versus disruption, I'll leave that to you to decide and distinguish between the two. But disruption allows us to get up off our comfort zones and realize, again, what the common denominators are and what the least of these are, right? And so when we look at the scenario in Ferguson and an 18-year-old African-American male, right, who was doing whatever he was doing but received spontaneous capital punishment. And we would rather spend more time justifying why he should have, right, versus lamenting with his parents. We spend more time trying to justify what happened in our perception of the facts than thinking about the other young people who were there and the anxiety that they now carry. We spend more time trying to figure out what lawyer is going to use what trick and stunt in order to get this and not get this, and why didn't they have a special prosecutor, and who's on the jury box, versus trying to bring healing to a community that will forever be ripped open. And for me, that's where the conversation is. Right? Because we can talk about what he did and didn't do, but I can talk about what Paul did and didn't do. And the fact that Paul got forgiveness and became a phenomenal, phenomenal ambassador of Christ's love because he got a chance to live. And so it comes down to life or death, which is that anxiety. So as African American, I got pulled over 3 months ago. And I get to talk all over the world, phenomenal places. I'm on the radio once a week on WGBH, which is, Boston's NPR station. And I got pulled over 3 months ago. And guess what I did? I put my hands on the steering wheel. And when the cop came over, a police officer, excuse me. When the police officer, I'm from LA, I'm sorry. When the police officer came to, my apologies, came to the window, my window was up. My wife was sitting in the passenger seat of a minivan. My 2 sons were behind me, and my father-in-law was in the car behind me. And the officer says, license and registration. I still have my hands on the steering wheel, and I said, officer, I'm going to release my left hand off the steering wheel to push the button on my door to roll the window down. This was what my father taught me at the age of 6. Talk about anxiety. And every move that I made, I announced it first. Officer, I'm taking my left hand. I'm going to put it in my left pocket to retrieve my wallet, which I would bring up, and I would sit on the steering wheel so you can watch me open my wallet to pull my license out. It's on the left side. It's a flap here. And so the officer looked at me. Then he looked in my van, saw my wife, saw my 11-year-old and my 9-year-old, whose eyes were big bulgy, right? Because they had already had the lesson. So they carried the anxiety as well. They didn't know what was about to happen, right? And so the point that I'm trying to make is that we all come to this conversation from different places. And before we can have the conversation, we have to acknowledge what our platforms are. We have to acknowledge where we enter the conversation. And that's why the challenge in this country and around the world of having these conversations of race relations, which will eventually, I pray, get to racial reconciliation. But the first conversation is to be transparent and vulnerable, to allow your fears to be heard, to allow your concerns and your cares to be voiced, and for you to express where you're coming from. Because when we put our cards on the table, then we disarm one another. And then we can actually have real conversation, which brings real healing, which brings forward progress, which brings, I believe, glory to God. Thank you.
Thank you to Mark and Dennis and Emmett. As is our custom, let's open it up for some questions, not sermons, some questions. And we've got a really rich panel with us, and pray that some of the wisdom would circulate. So we invite you to join the conversation. Who wants to ask a question? There are some mics around the room, and so that everybody can hear, let's speak up. Who wants to start us off? Patrick.
Thanks to each of you for your participation on this panel. Very, very important conversation. Much resonated with me. A couple questions, and love to hear Dr. Hollinger chime in on this, but specifically one question targeted more so to Dr. Harden, but others can comment, and then another towards Dr. Price. Dr. Harden, I would love to hear you maybe chat just a little bit about the distinction between law enforcement maybe and policing, and maybe a distinction between bad policing and good policing, and maybe the kind of recent rise in kind of the militarizing of policing, probably in the last 25 years or however long, on one hand, and then for Dr. Price and Dr. Hollinger, just maybe if you could touch a little bit, you mentioned, Dr. Price, about the first conversation being vulnerable and express where we're coming from. One of the challenges that many African Americans have had in talking about this whole thing is the fact that oftentimes they don't feel that, at least let's say African American males, that they can be angry, right? Because to become angry about something becomes life-threatening. So maybe if you both could reflect a little bit on the role in Christian ethics of anger with respect to perceived social injustice. Thank you.
That last question was tough, so I'll let Dr. Hollinger handle that. But I think your question really is a good one. And again, in a little historical context, when I became a police officer in the 80s, by the way, I too was taught as Emmett. I don't think I was 6 years old, but I was taught and reinforced throughout my whole life how to behave with police officers. And I thought I was doing a pretty good job. And as a teenager, I was beaten by police officers. So even though I'm proud of my career in I was going to say ministry, in police work at that time, I was able to overcome those challenges and still become a police officer, which is another story, another forum. But during the 1980s, the militarization of law enforcement began to grab hold. Laws changed. We had administrative laws come in where the bad guy, especially as it relates to drugs, they knew the laws and they knew what they could get away with. And so one of the things that would often happen is people would get arrested and they would have so much money and they will be able to get their money back, even being caught in the role of a crime, that we changed the laws. So when we say administrative laws, laws were changed so we can take their money from them. And it was forfeiture laws is what we call them. And a lot of it started in L.A. Emmett didn't have anything to do with it, but it happened in L.A. But because I know stereotypes, I could see them floating up. No, Dr. Price was involved. But anyways, that was beginning to happen, and there was a strong emphasis that grew out of the 70s on policing. So when you say policing to me, that means I could walk down the street on a beat and say hi to someone, and they wouldn't give me a drink of soda out of their backyard barbecue party, and I knew everybody's name in the barbershop that I walked into. As a police officer, people knew me, and they called me. So there was this kind of, they watched my back, was the expectation that if I get in trouble, you guys, if I can't get to my radio, you will call help for me. So there was this community relationship building. And what we found out by research is that was so effective. We developed DARE and so forth. Many of you heard of DARE, education for children in schools. And so that was almost like a partnership through policing. And the image that they burned in our mind was that if you are an effective police officer, you never have to draw your gun. And when I became a police officer, some of the best officers I admired are those who never drew their gun. They never raised their voice because they knew the escalation matrix that you learn, that when you raise your voice, I was stopped a few weeks ago. And the officer came to my car and he yelled at me. And my hands were on the steering wheel, and I was confused because I thought I was doing everything. But I thought to myself, like, whoa, we were taught that the state police were the model police officers because when they gave you a ticket, you thanked them. They were so nice. You said, thank you, officer. It's $190, ticket, And so that's what we refer to policing. Now, enforcement and apprehension was another thing. And it seems to me in recent years that apprehension and being able to fight against the rising drugs, because in the 80s and 90s, if you recall, drug wars were on, not only between rival drug dealers and their gangs, but even with the police. And so that contributed to that race. And so the mindset, again, changed in terms of the politicians and the government in arming police officers. But what we're talking about now is how do we lose sight of policing in that regard? And so that's a very good question. So when we think about remedies and so forth, we have to think about what we're asking for. Are we asking for police officers to wear full armor, more armor, larger bullets? I don't even know if they can get larger, but or are we asking for more policing?
Can I just follow up with a question on that, Mark? I've often heard people say that one ought to be able to shoot to wound and prevent as opposed to shoot to kill. Is that just an unrealistic idea, would you say, as a former police officer? Or could that be implemented in
It's
any way?
totally unrealistic. We're trained to shoot twice, and both are in the kill area. We never shoot to wound. Police officers are not trained to do that. There's case law behind that rationale, and there's also anecdotal evidence of surviving an incident. So you never shoot someone, because when you use your firearm, it's considered deadly force, and the courts have ruled that once you use it, it's deadly force. You can't use a handgun to partially kill somebody. That's just the general.
Dr. Price.
Sure.
Come on into the conversation there.
This notion of anger, I think it's a great topic because, I used to believe, and I don't believe this anymore, I used to believe that it was sinful to be angry, right? I had a Sunday school teacher at some point in my life who would just, it was sinful to be angry. And my own reading of the Bible says that anger is a human nature. The question is, or the challenge is, do not allow your anger to make you sin. Right, and I think that's where the distinction is. So I think, there are a number of individuals, black, white, yellow, blue, magenta, fuchsia, who have anger that has not been dealt with. And so for me, part of our Christian journey and part of our faith walk is to really deal with those unreconciled issues that we have along the way. Pastorally, I find a lot of, particularly young men of color who have a chip on their shoulder. And whether the chip is reasonable or not, or is founded, it's not my issue. The issue is, let's do the work to get rid of the chip, because there's a lot of life to be lived, and you're not living to your fullest or as abundantly as you can be living, as the word says, with the chip on your shoulder. And so part of our challenge as pastors and as clergy is to help people deal with their unreconciled issues, where anger is a huge one, right? And so part of the notion is that there's a role of forgiveness in this situation, right? There's a role for expressing your fears and your frustrations, but also the failed expectations, right? And I think in those conversations, we're actually able to deal with our anger, right? If there's something that I'm angry about right now, it's about the privatization of the prison industrial complex, right? I'm angry about that, right? That people are endeavoring to make a whole lot of money on what we're calling the preschool to prison pipeline, right? Where they identify individuals, mostly in inner city situations, and basically say that based on their early examinations, they're not going to be anything. So we're going to create a bed, we're going to create a cot and 3 cots, or a cot and 3 hots, right, for them, right? Because they're going to end up in, and let me do a little interpretation, right? The prison cell is the cot, right? And the 3 meals a day are the 3 hots, right? And so we're going to create a trajectory by which we know that we're going to need X amount of prison cells in the coming years. So we're going to build that and actually make money on that. I'm absolutely angry about that, but I pray that my anger doesn't create sin, right? And so I think that's where we try to reconcile that.
And I think, Patrick, my take on that is that anger is, first of all, a good gift of God. And like many of the good gifts of God, it can get misused in our fallenness. And I don't think we can deal with issues of justice without some degree of anger. I mean, when I watched Selma and I saw the woman turned away by the clerk when she went to register to vote, I was angry. I mean, I said something out loud. I don't know if Marianne remembers it, but I just, visceral, And I don't think we can deal with injustices without anger. So I look at it that there's got to be several different kinds of anger. There is, as Emmett said, there is that anger which is a sin. Be angry and yet do not sin. Don't let the sun go down in your wrath. So that there's an anger which is a more principled anger, and then there's an anger which simply takes control of us emotionally. And we lose all perspective, and that emotion is not balanced by other good emotions, which I think are important to achieve harmony and make progress in our lives and in society as a whole. I would simply add to that, Scripture describes God, the wrath of God, the anger of God, which I take it as not just a rage kind of anger, but a more principled anger at the wrong, the sin, and the violations of human beings in our world.
Hi guys, my name is Burton Miller, and one question that I had, especially for you, Dr. Price, speaking about being in Los Angeles, is maybe drawing some comparisons between the 91-92 Rodney King riots and what's been happening in the last 2 years, 1 to 2 years here, but more specifically looking back on what the Christian conversation was about that and kind of the interpretation and the reaction and the response, and maybe there's anything we can learn from that, or maybe anything that you think that we should be remembering from that time that maybe some of us have blind spots to.
Sure, that's a great question. Really glad that you asked that. I did a book a couple of years ago called The Black Church and Hip Hop Culture Towards Bridging Generational Divide. It was an edited volume. And in the introduction to the book, I argued that if the church, and I used the black church as a case study for the church at large, if the church was where it needed to be during the 1960s and the 1970s, we wouldn't have hip hop culture, right? Because hip hop culture came out of disenfranchised, ostracized young people who felt like they didn't have a voice and felt like the adults in their lives were just messing up everything. And so they used self-determination and created this culture for them to have an expression. In 1991, 92, you find a confluence of different things. One, that hip-hop culture had been commodified by corporate entities, and so the voice was gone. And so young people felt, and myself being there, felt like we had absolutely no outlet, right? And for many of us, we sat in church and listened to our preachers preach about forgiveness and about redemption and about all the great things that we preach about. But when we were on the streets and, being harassed by, police officers and whatnot, there's a total disconnect, right? And as a young person, you're actually looking for the order, right? You're looking for the streets to reflect what the preacher's preaching on Sunday, right? And when there's a disconnect, you basically have so much anxiety, anger, angst, that your only way out is to allow for what I would call sinful nature, right? And so in that sense, there was so much absolute rage in 91, 92, particularly as a response to the Rodney King verdict, where these police officers who were videotaped again, right, abusing this gentleman were off, right? And so the question was, when does justice come? And young people took to the streets and looted and did all kind of heinous and horrific things. That doesn't make them evil people. They just were young people with rage who did evil things. And I think that's the other piece that we have. We do a lot of name calling. When we see people who are messing up their own neighborhoods, which happened in Los Angeles, right? It was the African American neighborhood that was ripped open, which is not right. But it didn't make the young people evil. It made them young people with rage who were doing evil things in response to, what they saw, which is the same thing we see in Ferguson, right? Where these young people who are not evil people, right? They're young people with so much rage. I lived in St. Louis for a year, and St. Louis is a very interesting place because it literally is white and black, right? And there's a certain street, Delmar Avenue, which goes this way, and on one side you have the black neighborhood, and on this side you have the white neighborhood. It's just that kind of polarizing. And so you have these young people who felt like there was no opportunity for them to express their rage. One of their young brothers had just gotten murdered in the street and had sat in the street for 4.5. You guys know all the particulars. And the fact was that they took to the streets. Now, my thing is there were clergy there, and God bless those clergy there. Some went from Boston and surrounding areas to go there. My challenge is that we are always reactive, and we're never there before, right? And that's the issue, right? So the kind of divine timing piece, this aspect, I think, which is where we have to kind of pay more attention to the sounds and the feels of the streets so that we can sense things coming and not be so caught up in what we're doing that we miss the buzz and the murmurs before the stuff happens. And I think that's our learning piece. Because it's going to happen again, unfortunately. Unfortunately, it's going to happen again. The question is, will we already be there, meaning the church, right, to be able to intervene and to intercede with prayer, right, with teaching, right, with fellowship, right, with preaching, right, with all the things that we do, that we know to do to bring healing and hope to individuals who are hopeless, because we kind of know where they are. Right, we can do this systematic, studies and look at, the population in Ferguson. I think the population of African Americans who voted in Ferguson before that happened was like 40%. Right, so we know what disenfranchisement looks and disengagement looks like. Right, those are symptoms of what is to come. And so I think the church has to be ready to mobilize and to be out there before things happen. I'm glad you asked that question.
Fine.
I feel like this conversation sometimes could be very black and white, and I mean that by after Ferguson, you see a lot of vocal Anglo-Americans talking, a lot of African-Americans talking. How could someone like me or Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans could join that conversation and participate?
Well, I'll say something real quick.
Yep.
I think you don't have to participate in the conversation because you're already having it. And I think the fact that you see the conversation that you're involved in separate and apart is actually the issue, right? Because we're all disenfranchised in some way, shape, or form, right? Dean Harden talked about the isms and the obias already, right? And so we're wrestling with that. When we looked at the protests on I-93, the most recent one where the young people were cemented themselves to those pylons, right? While everybody was, kind of castigating the scenario, most people didn't realize that only one of the 8 or 9 people was African American. That was a diverse population there was one young lady who was indigenous. There was a couple young ladies who were of Asian descent, right? And so while we're jumping down the throats of what we perceive to be going on, we're actually missing that the Ferguson protest movement, if you actually go to the website and look at the movement at large, it's actually not white and or black. It's like a whole bunch of people who represent all kind of cross sectors of life. And so the challenge is, how do we allow our conversations that we're having in these certain pockets to connect and unite with the other conversations that are going on? And I think that's where the beauty is, when we can push the conversations and allow them to link up, as opposed to having, the group at Gordon-Conwell, the group at Northeastern, the group at wherever, and let these conversations live.
There's not much to add to that. I just want to say I've seen it all over the world, and ditto to that. Plus, whether you go to a suburb of Paris or South Africa, you'll see, you won't just see black Africans, you'll see a lot of Asians, Chinese, Indians, and so forth there, all caring about that one issue. Yeah. And so it is more diverse than we give it credit for often. It's just that in this scenario you have us 3 up here, it looks like it's black and white. But the president is not just white.
He is, though. One thing I would add, I think if you look closely at the tensions that are occurring in American society, they aren't just white-black. Right. They go in multiple ways, and I think that's important to understand. And I think that as demographic shifts occur over time, we may see greater tensions between varying ethnic groups. And so I think it's helpful for us to remember that even though historically it was a white-black issue in many ways, it has become much more diverse in our own time.
Yeah.
Right behind you there.
Yeah, thank you all again. One of the things I like to ask you, like with the idea of the Ferguson, and you had said, how'd you put it? Delayed. What was
Justice.
Delayed justice is denied, right? And so one of the things I'm thinking about is even just that fact we're talking about Ferguson right now, and I know we were set back, you know what I mean, this had to be rescheduled, you know what I mean, but Ferguson has, I mean, this is kind of late to be talking about, would you agree? You know, but it's good that we need to be doing it, so I'm not saying, you know, anything by that. But a lot of things that Eric Gardner happened, you know, we haven't mentioned, you know, much of that, at least I didn't hear it, maybe you were referenced to it, I just didn't hear it, but that was a big thing for our generation to see it. You can Google that and just watch everything take place. And so it's just like, so that was a tipping scale for, I know, at least for me and people ethnically like me, you know, to say like, whoa. You know, the Ferguson thing was a removed thing where it was like, okay, maybe you weren't there, you don't know, you know what it's like to be a police officer, you don't know what it's like, you never lived in the streets, you don't know, you know, I mean, you weren't there, you don't know nothing. That was like, oh, wow, I was just standing on the sidewalk, even though I'm watching on my computer. It's as if I was standing right there on the sidewalk watching the whole thing. Yeah. You see what I mean? So anyway, the scales are really starting to tip into the place of, and thank you for this. I think this is doing it in the minds of a lot of people, even right now. I think people are ready to say, we agree. Like you don't need to convince us anymore. We agree. Thank you for, you know, for explaining it even more so and giving us the history of it, and we need that as well. But we agree. Now, what do we do? Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, what do we do? So thank you also for, you know, let's move in for the healing. Thank you for leveraging your leadership, you know, Dr. Lentz, for creating this. Thank you all for coming and sitting in the seats and giving us the wisdom. From here, now leaving this conversation, where do you as leaders go in your own churches, community, and leadership? How do you leverage privilege, leadership, influence, all of that? And what can you say to people who, with MDivs, getting ready to enter where you're sitting, you know, in years to come? Yeah. What do we do? You know, how do we move forward?
It's a brilliant question because, right, as we've been kind of myopically localized on the Ferguson piece, from that moment when that happened to the end of December, there were 35 different situations like that, right? And so so part of the issue is the mediation of these scenarios, right? And the fact that we're getting we're getting the facts secondhand through a commodified entity, right? I'll talk about this as the era of TMZ, right? Because TMZ is dropping dimes on everybody, right? And I mean, you know, and so part of the challenge is we look at this from a objectification of a male body situation, but there have been females who have been murdered as well, and their stories are rarely told, right? The Boko Haram situation got 2.5 days in the media, and then it went away, right? And so there has to be this sense of our ability to embrace these real-life situations and bring them into the folds of our ministry, right? Because the people in my congregation ask the same question as you ask. You know, great that you can theorize it, great that you can analyze it, but what do we do? And so my response to you is the same response that I'm going to give to the class that I'm teaching on the history and theology of worship. You can't worship the same way, right? Because when you carry the burdens of these individuals, it changes the very nature of your worship, right? It changes the very nature of your lament. It changes the very nature of how you pray and who you pray for, right? And are we willing to do the hard work to pray for those who trespass against us? See, that's a hard one. It takes work to pray for those who trespass against you, right? Because we go into a us versus them scenario, right? And then we create this kind of this bifurcation or this dichotomy. But God is challenging us to pray for those individuals, right? And that changes the very nature of how you worship, right? And I'm not talking about changing your liturgy and the structure and the order of your service. I'm talking about your heart, right? It forces you to be a more forgiving person. Yeah, and that's hard to do because we're in pain, we're hurt, right? And part of our healing is forgiving those who have trespassed against us. Pray for them, and then try to glean and hear their story. Where are they coming from? Darren Wilson was an angry person. He was hurt. And I don't know what scenarios hurt him in his life, and it's none of my business. But the fact is that he was a hurt young man. And he deserves our prayers too. And it's not more or less than Michael Brown Jr. and Michael Brown Jr.'s family, but he deserves our prayers as well, right? Going back to Trayvon Martin, right, and his family. But George Zimmerman was a hurt individual. We can tell that And he deserves our prayers as well, right? Because if we're going to walk in the faith, we can't only pick the winning team, right? We pray for everybody.
Yeah, I would like to add to that because on the practical side of your question, Martin Luther King Jr. didn't just protest, he organized. And when we organize, we just don't organize, we communicate our values. And so you have to see all of these things as interconnected, not as ad hoc actions that are disconnected. Right. So they're all important. So when we come together, when the administration puts together something like this, we're communicating what we value, right. That the topic is too important for us not to talk about it. And that's why Dr. Lentz, when he read that statement earlier, that statement that he read, part of the statement, the whole statement was asking seminaries to say something. Don't just sit on your hands, but say something, talk about it, do something. And so when we want to change our homes, when we want to change our schools, when we want to change our communities, we have to, it's going to be 85% of what we do, more than 85% of more, and the rest is what we say. Let me put it that way. Yeah. So what we do does matter. It communicates our values. It demonstrates our values to our children and to our colleagues, and it creates an opportunity for voice. Yes, but what's said is it's not just that. So I would say that it's the organizing that is real critical, and that's kind of been my question behind watching all the protests across the country. Just wondering, and there has been some good organizing behind this, no doubt. But I'm not sure what kind of organizing is happening in our ranks when we talk about the church itself.
Yeah.
Dennis?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different ways to respond to the practical side. I mean, one side of me looks at this as a seminary administrator, seminary president, and says we have to work a lot harder to make sure that you all have opportunities to learn from folks from different nationalities, ethnic groups, and races. And that's part of the healing, that's part of the reconciliation, and I'm deeply committed to that. I would also say that for those of you who are going into pastoral ministry, you've got to preach about it. Yes. And there's a lot of biblical text. I mean, I think of Ephesians chapter 2, which we quote all the time as the great text about being saved by God's grace through faith, not of works. And then, of course, the very next verse is, we are created for good works. And then it goes on to deal with one of the first major social ethics issues that the church faced. It was a racial issue. It was the divide between Jewish believers and Gentile believers who put their worlds together in vastly different ways, who had immense different experiences in life growing up, who had all kind of labels that they used against each other, and there was a tremendous need for healing. And so Paul addresses that after this great passage on justification by faith and hits right to it. And if you preach on Ephesians 2, you've got to deal with that text, and you've got to apply it to the racial and ethnic realities of our world. Yeah. And there are many other texts as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have a beautiful vision. I think your vision is going to take time. And I think that's one of the things that we try to rush progress. And the reality is that progress is on the way, right? Because we believe in a God who would never leave us nor forsake us. But the reality is it takes time, right? And so I would argue that that progress happens in a cellular moment. And what I mean by that is that if we can make change, systemic change here, right, and the sphere of influence that leaves here, which is exponential, will go forth and spread that change, allowing us to be leaders of that change, right? And so I think you know the old adage, you clean up your own home first, and then you hit the neighborhood, right? And I think that's the approach that we have to take. And knowing what your home looks like helps you to imagine the amount of time that it takes and the amount of energy that it takes. And so one is the level of commitment, right? And then the second level is, as Dean Harden talked about, is what are our goals and how we strategize, these goals. And back to the point that I make about the common denominators and the least of these. Because all of us have a variety of goals, and we will go absolutely nowhere if we don't reach the common denominator of those goals, right? Because you move from agendas to goal setting, right, which has to be collective. So it has to be by unanimous vote, if it will. And then when you come up with those 1 to 2 things, then you move forward. But it takes time.
One final question.
I believe God's work is moving because from an outsider's point of view, all the African people come to this continent was selected. Before they can land here, there are challenges. So actually, from my point of view, if I'm correct, I don't know if I'm correct, God prepared His truth for the future. Yeah. So all the African Americans, they are Christians now. They receive the full Christianity in this country. Especially, I believe God prepared His truth in the future, maybe for the Africans. I don't know if I'm correct, but you can see those people, because I was a rugby coach in Taiwan Army. I was so envious. Every year I saw the Super Bowl. I was jealous. They have so many good sportsmen. 2008, I was in Beijing. I saw so many gold medal, silver medal by the black people. And I believe God chose His people with His purpose, with the religion training for His purpose.
Let me just, Caleb, if I can add just one thought to that. God often works beyond our intentions. Africans were brought to these shores not from their willingness by any stretch of the imagination. It was and you have to look at it as an institutional issue. Slavery was an institution. It was an economic institution. Right. It was unjust. It was horrific in every way. And despite the evils that were done, and this is because of the great power of God, God is able to work and bring redemption out of that. And so God was at work in the evils that we perpetrate, and God is continually at work even in the evils that are perpetrated today to bring good, to bring people to Himself, to bring justice, to bring healing, to bring cleansing, and so forth. It doesn't justify the acts that caused the injustice and wrong in the first place. It simply is a great tribute to the kind of God we have out of the mess we make as human beings, whether it be in the racial, ethnic area or many areas of life. God can overcome those and work despite our sins and despite our wrongs.
Amen.
I would like to add something, and maybe this speaks more to the other point. We do want to be careful that when we want to, when we see injustice being done to a particular people, whether it's based on class or racial, it doesn't matter, or gender, okay? But when we reach out to these people, what I see Christians do that sometimes does not help the problem much is that they have a paternalistic approach. And so whenever we reach out, we have to do it with compassion. We have to put a human face on things. And so even though, I was thinking about this as Dr. Hollinger was talking about preaching, and I was thinking about other texts as well. It is so important, and it's so strongly communicated, in my opinion, in the Bible, is that we really empower the weak, those we perceive to be the victim, as opposed to thinking that we're the solution to help them, because that will exacerbate the problem. And one of the things that's done that Dr. Emmett Price mentioned earlier is that if you look at voting patterns in Ferguson, they were low. They were low for a reason. That was an outcome, a symptom of something that was much deeper. And so sometimes we need to ask why to get to the right type of solution. Why aren't they voting? So if we work to empower people to have and show them that their voice does matter, and that we can give them hope through preaching of the gospel to have voice, then we can begin to see changes. So when we answer the question of how do we do something about this, there's so much can be done through preaching and teaching. But a lot of it centers, that preaching and teaching centers on giving people hope to believe that not only do they matter, but they can do something.
Right. Amen.
I want to get the last word in as the moderator, but let me get the last word in as the moderator. March the 12th, we're back here with Dr. Anthony Bradley, a kind of gadfly in the evangelical community on race issues. We're going to be talking about race and grace. So the conversation will continue. And I want to just close with some words from another Gordon-Conwell connection, Pastor Brian Loritz, who was here for our preaching conferences last year, and we've just confirmed that he's going to be teaching a course for us next January. On his blog, an African-American pastor of a multi-ethnic, very large church in Memphis, Tennessee, he writes, "If you sense, and I hope you hear the echoes from the conversation earlier, if you sense exasperation from we African Americans over yet another news story of a black man slain at the hands of a white man, this is a wonderful opportunity to grab some coffee and seek to understand our hearts. I need my white brothers to know how I felt as I sat in the preaching classes in Bible college and seminary, not once hearing examples of great African American preachers. I need you to know how I felt when I was forced face down on the hard asphalt of Crenshaw Boulevard in Los Angeles, all because I was 19 and driving my pastor's Lexus, a year after the 1993 Rodney King riots." Maybe not coffee here today, but pizza. And I hope you have entered into the story as Mark opened his comments to hear each other's hearts on this issue in particular, but on a host of other issues. And pray that our hearts are prepared to listen. And so with that, let's thank our panelists. And let me dismiss us with prayer. Oh God, open our hearts to each other by your Spirit. Move in us. Break down the walls that alienate us from each other and from you. Grant us your peace, we pray in the name of Jesus. Amen. Amen.